I wasn't looking for trouble. Honestly, I wasn't. But sometimes, trouble finds you, even when you're just trying to enjoy a quiet evening at home. That night started like any other. Alice, was out at her usual writing session at the coffee shop. It had become her ritual: grab a latte, find a corner table, and lose herself in her latest novel. I didn't mind. I'd always supported her writing, even when it meant eating cold takeout because she'd forgotten dinner in a haze of inspiration. I was tidying up the house when I noticed it, a neat stack of papers on her desk. Normally, Alice kept her drafts locked away like they were top-secret government documents, but tonight, for whatever reason, she'd left them out. Curiosity got the better of me. I knew she wouldn't want me reading her work before it was finished, but I figured one page wouldn't hurt. I sat down, picked up the first sheet, and started reading. The words jumped off the page, vivid and alive, like all her writing. Alice had always had a way of pulling you into a story. This one was no different, except for one thing. The characters felt familiar. Too familiar. The heroine was a writer, struggling to find her voice, feeling distant from her husband. And the hero? A charming, funny, ever so slightly flirtatious man named Daniel, who just happened to work at a coffee shop. Coincidence? Maybe. Until I got to the dialogue. One line in particular made my stomach twist. "You make me feel alive again," she said, her voice trembling. "Like I'm more than just someone's wife." I set the paper down, my pulse quickening. This wasn't just fiction. This was personal. I tried to shake it off. Writers draw from their lives all the time, don't they? That's what made their work authentic. But as I flipped through a few more pages, I couldn't ignore the way Alice described Daniel. The way her heroine lit up around him, laughed at his jokes, leaned in just a little too close. I knew Alice spent hours at that coffee shop, laptop open, headphones in, focused on her work. I'd never thought twice about it before. But now, I couldn't stop wondering. Was this just a story? Or was it something more? When Alice got home that night, she was glowing, her cheeks pink from the cool evening air. "Hey, babe," she said, leaning in to kiss me on the cheek. "How was your night?" "Good," I said, forcing a smile. "Yours?" "Productive," she replied, setting her bag down on the couch. "I think I finally cracked that scene I've been stuck on." I nodded, trying to keep my expression neutral. "That's great." She didn't notice anything off. She just smiled, went to the kitchen to pour herself a glass of wine, and started telling me about some funny interactions she'd had with the barista. The barista. Daniel. As she laughed and sipped her wine, I couldn't help but wonder, was I losing my wife to a character in her novel? Or to the man who inspired him? Either way, I knew one thing for sure: I couldn't ignore the questions buzzing in my head. Not anymore. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of Alice typing away on her laptop. She was perched at the dining table, her face illuminated by the glow of the screen. She always looked so focused when she wrote, her brow slightly furrowed, her fingers flying over the keys like they had a mind of their own. I watched her for a moment, wondering if I was just being paranoid. Maybe the similarities in her story were coincidental. Maybe this was just another one of those things writers did, borrowing pieces of the world around them and spinning them into fiction. But deep down, I didn't believe that. That evening, Alice left for the coffee shop again, her bag slung over her shoulder and her usual cheerful goodbye floating back at me from the doorway. "Don't wait up," she said with a grin. "You know how I get when the words are flowing." I nodded, forcing a smile as the door clicked shut behind her. The house was too quiet without her, but my thoughts weren't quiet at all. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Her laptop was still sitting on the table, its screen dark and unassuming. I told myself I wasn't going to snoop. I wasn't that kind of husband. But the draft I'd read the night before kept replaying in my mind, the words like whispers I couldn't ignore. Before I realized what I was doing, I was sitting at the table, opening the laptop. Her email was already open. At the top of her inbox, bolded and unread, was a message from someone named Daniel. My heart pounded as I clicked on it. Subject, last night. The message wasn't long, but every word felt like a punch to the gut. I can't stop thinking about your laugh. It's infectious, you know? Made me feel like a kid again. Let me know when you're free next, I've got some ideas for that story of yours. See you soon, Daniel. Ideas for her story. Sure. That's all it was. Just brainstorming between a writer and her friendly neighborhood barista. But then I noticed the folder in her inbox labeled Daniel Drafts. My stomach twisted as I opened it. Inside were dozens of emails, each one a piece of a puzzle I didn't want to see completed. Their messages weren't overtly romantic, not at first. They started with casual notes about coffee and writing, sprinkled with inside jokes about customers or funny things that happened at the shop. But as I read further, the tone shifted. You make me feel like I can do anything, one email said. Like I'm finally alive. Another, you're incredible, Alice. Don't let anyone ever tell you otherwise. Especially him. Him. That was me. When Alice came home that night, I pretended to be asleep. I couldn't face her, not yet. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the words from Daniel's emails playing over and over in my mind. I'd never thought of myself as the jealous type, but this wasn't jealousy. This was betrayal, hidden under the guise of creativity and collaboration. Was it physical? Probably not. But in some ways, the emotional intimacy felt worse. The worst part was, she didn't even seem guilty. She kissed me lightly on the forehead, crawled into bed, and fell asleep within minutes. Meanwhile, I lay there, wide awake, wondering what the hell I was supposed to do now. The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about the emails. Each one was like a tiny needle, pricking at my confidence, my trust, my sanity. Alice moved through the house as if everything was normal, her smile bright, her laugh effortless. But now, all I could see were the cracks. When she kissed me goodbye that evening and left for the coffee shop, I felt the same coldness creeping in, the same nagging question, was she really going there to write? Or was Daniel waiting for her? This time, I followed her. I told myself I wasn't being irrational, that I had every right to know the truth. I waited a few minutes after she left, then grabbed my keys and drove to the coffee shop. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, my heart pounding harder with every turn. When I got there, I parked across the street, far enough away to avoid being seen. Through the large glass windows, I could see her. She was sitting at her usual spot by the corner, her laptop open, a cup of coffee steaming beside her. At first, it looked innocent enough. She was typing, focused, like I'd seen her do 1,000 times before. And then he appeared. Daniel. He brought her a drink, something that wasn't on the menu, judging by the way she laughed when he handed it to her. She said something, and he laughed too, leaning casually against the table. The way he looked at her, the way she smiled back, it wasn't the look of a barista and a customer. It was something more. My stomach churned as I watched him pull out a chair and sit down across from her. They talked, laughed, and occasionally leaned in close, their heads nearly touching. I couldn't watch anymore. I left the coffee shop and drove aimlessly, my thoughts racing. A part of me wanted to confront her right then and there, to walk into that coffee shop and demand answers. But another part of me, the part that was scared of what I might hear, held me back. I didn't want an argument. I wanted the truth. When Alice got home later that night, I was sitting at the dining table, her laptop in front of me. She froze in the doorway, her smile faltering. "Hey," she said cautiously. "What are you doing?" I looked up at her, my face calm but my hands trembling. "Who's Daniel?" Her eyes widened, and for a moment, she said nothing. The silence was deafening, stretching between us like a chasm. Finally, she set her bag down and crossed her arms. "He's a friend. Someone I talked to at the coffee shop." "A friend?" I repeated, my voice sharper than I intended. "Alice, I've seen the emails. I've seen the way he talks to you. Is that what friends do? She sighed, her shoulders slumping. It's not what you think, Mark. Then tell me what it is, I said, standing now, my voice rising. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been pouring your heart out to some guy while leaving me in the dark. Her face crumpled, and she sank into the nearest chair. It's just, he listens, okay? He gets it. He gets me. I've been stuck, creatively and emotionally. And when I talk to him, it's like I can breathe again. I stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. And what about me, Alice? Am I just, here? A placeholder while you connect with someone else? Her voice broke. No. Mark, I love you. I've always loved you. But you don't see me anymore. You don't ask how I'm doing, or care about what I'm writing. You're always so busy, so distant. Her words hit like a punch to the gut. Was she right? Had I been distant? But that didn't justify what she'd done. Do you have feelings for him? I asked quietly, my voice trembling. She hesitated, and that hesitation felt like the final nail in the coffin. I don't know, she whispered. I couldn't speak. I couldn't think. I just turned and walked out the door, the sound of her calling my name echoing behind me. I needed air. I needed time. But most of all, I needed to figure out if I could live with the cracks in our marriage, or if this was the moment it all fell apart. I didn't go far. Just the park a few blocks from our house, where the cool night air wrapped around me like a lifeline. I sat on a bench under the flickering streetlight, trying to piece together the chaos in my mind. Alice's words echoed in my head, I don't know. That hesitation, that crack in her voice, had hit me harder than anything else. It wasn't just the emails or Daniel's lingering smiles. It was the fact that she couldn't even deny it outright. I wasn't ready to let go of everything we'd built, but I couldn't ignore what I'd seen, what I'd felt. By the time I got home, the lights were still on, and Alice was waiting for me at the dining table, her head buried in her hands. She looked up as soon as I walked in, her eyes red and swollen. You came back, she said softly. For now, I replied, my voice flat. She nodded, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of the tablecloth. We need to talk. No kidding, I said, pulling out a chair and sitting across from her. The silence stretched between us, heavy and uncomfortable. Finally, I broke it. How long? Her lips trembled, but she met my gaze. A few months. It started with small talk at the coffee shop, and then... I don't know. It just grew. Grew, I repeated, bitterness seeping into my voice. Alice, do you even hear yourself? You've been having an emotional affair with some guy for months, and all you can say is that it grew? Her face crumpled, tears streaming down her cheeks. I didn't mean for it to happen, Mark. I swear. It was never supposed to be more than just someone to talk to. Talk to? I shot back, my voice rising. What about me, Alice? I'm right here. I've always been here. You're not, though, she cried, her voice breaking. You're always working, always busy. And when you're home, it's like I'm invisible. I tried to tell you how I was feeling, but you didn't want to hear it. You just drifted away. Her words hit like a punch to the gut. Had I been distant? Maybe. Work had been stressful, and I'd thrown myself into it, thinking that providing for us was enough. But now I realized it wasn't. I didn't know you felt that way, I said quietly, the anger draining from my voice. Because you didn't ask, she whispered. For a moment, the room was silent except for the sound of her quiet sobs. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling, trying to process everything. So, what now? I asked finally. Alice wiped her eyes, her voice trembling but determined. I'll stop talking to him. I'll delete the emails, block his number, whatever it takes. I don't want to lose you, Mark. Her words should have been reassuring, but they weren't. The damage was already done. Even if she cut Daniel out of her life, the cracks in our marriage wouldn't magically disappear. I need time, I said, standing up. Time to figure out if I can even trust you again. Mark, please, she said, her voice breaking. I looked at her, my heart aching despite everything. I'm not saying it's over. But I can't just pretend this didn't happen. You broke something, Alice. And I don't know if we can fix it. Her tears started again, but I couldn't stay. I grabbed my coat and left, the door clicking shut behind me like the end of a chapter one wasn't ready to finish. That night, I slept on my brother's couch. It wasn't comfortable, but it was better than being in the house, surrounded by memories that felt like lies. As I stared at the ceiling, one thought kept running through my mind. Do I fight for this marriage, or do I let it go? And for the first time, I wasn't sure which answer I wanted. A few days passed before I went home. I'd needed the space to think, to let the chaos in my mind settle into something resembling clarity. Staying at my brother's place had helped. He wasn't the kind of guy to pry, but his presence was steady, grounding. When I finally walked through the front door, the house was eerily quiet. Alice's car was in the driveway, so I knew she was home. I found her sitting on the couch, her knees pulled up to her chest, staring blankly at the dark TV. She looked up as I entered, her expression a mix of hope and fear. "Hey," she said softly. "Hey," I replied, setting my bag down. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The air between us felt heavy, charged with everything that had been left unsaid. "I wasn't sure if you were coming back," she admitted. "I wasn't sure either," I said honestly, taking a seat in the chair across from her. Alice sat up a little straighter, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," she began, her voice trembling. "About the trust one broke, and how distant we've been. And I just want you to know that I'm sorry, Mark. For all of it." I nodded, waiting for her to continue. "I've already deleted everything," she said quickly. "The emails, his number, it's all gone. I haven't been to the coffee shop since you left, and I don't plan to go back. I swear, I'm done with Daniel. Completely." Her words sounded genuine, and for the first time, I saw how exhausted she looked, like she hadn't slept in days. But trust isn't something you can rebuild overnight. "I appreciate that," I said slowly. "But, Alice, this isn't just about him. It's about us. You said I've been distant, and you're right. I got so caught up in work and everything else that I didn't see what you were going through. But instead of telling me, you turned to someone else." "I know," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "And I hate myself for it. I didn't know how to talk to you anymore. You seemed so untouchable. Like you didn't need me." Her voice broke on the last word, and for the first time, I saw the depth of her loneliness. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of her confession settling between us. "I don't know if I can trust you again," I said finally, my voice low but steady. "But I want to try. If you're willing to work on this, then so am I. But it's going to take time, Alice. A lot of time." She nodded quickly, her tears spilling over. "I'll do whatever it takes. Therapy, counseling, anything. I don't want to lose you, Mark." Her sincerity was palpable, and despite everything, a small part of me wanted to believe her. To believe that we could fix this, even if it meant starting from scratch. Over the next few weeks, we started to rebuild. It wasn't easy. There were awkward conversations, moments of doubt, and nights when the weight of what had happened felt almost unbearable. But there were also moments of connection, small, tentative steps back toward each other. We started going to therapy together, where we talked about things we'd never addressed before, her loneliness, my workaholism, the ways we'd both let the marriage drift. I began to see Alice not as the woman who had betrayed me, but as the woman I'd fallen in love with all those years ago, flawed, yes, but still someone worth fighting for. One evening, as we sat together on the couch, Alice handed me a notebook. "What's this?" I asked, flipping it open. "It's a new story I'm working on," she said nervously. It's about us. About what happened. I thought, maybe you'd want to read it. Her vulnerability in that moment took me by surprise. I started reading, and as the pages turned, I felt something shift. The story was raw and honest, detailing everything from her perspective, the mistakes, the regrets, the hope for redemption. By the time I finished, I realized something important. She wasn't trying to justify what she'd done. She was trying to show me that she understood the depth of her actions, and that she was willing to do whatever it took to make things right. As I closed the notebook, I looked over at her. "It's good," I said, my voice softer than I expected. She smiled, a flicker of relief crossing her face. "We're not there yet," I continued. "But I think we're on the right track." Alice nodded, her eyes glistening. "One step at a time." "One step at a time," I echoed. That night, as I lay in bed, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks: hope. Our marriage wasn't perfect. It might never be perfect. But it was ours, and for the first time in a long time, I believed it was worth saving. A few months later, things felt different. Not perfect, far from it. But there was a rhythm to our lives again, a fragile sense of normalcy that we were both learning to trust. Alice had started writing at home, turning the dining table into her makeshift office. At first, it felt strange seeing her there instead of at the coffee shop. But over time, the sight of her typing away with her headphones on became comforting. Familiar, even. Therapy had helped. We'd learned how to talk to each other again, not just about the big, hard things, but about the little moments too. Like how her day was going, or what I wanted for dinner, or what color we should paint the guest room. Small steps, but they mattered. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching a movie, Alice turned to me, her expression thoughtful. "You know," she began hesitantly, "I was thinking about submitting my story. The one about us." I raised an eyebrow. "The one I read?" She nodded. "I think it might help people, couples who've been through something like this. What do you think?" For a moment, I didn't know what to say. The idea of our story being out there, exposed to the world, felt vulnerable. But then I thought about how far we'd come, and how much we'd learned about each other in the process. "I think it's a great idea," I said finally. "If it feels right to you, then do it." Her face lit up, and for the first time in months, I saw the spark that had drawn me to her all those years ago. A few weeks later, Alice got an email from a publisher. They wanted her story. I didn't expect to feel anything about it, but when she told me, I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. Not just in her, but in us. We'd taken something broken and messy and turned it into something meaningful. The day the book was published, Alice handed me a copy, her cheeks flushed with excitement. The dedication on the first page stopped me cold. "For Mark, who taught me that love isn't about never breaking, it's about finding the strength to rebuild." I looked at her, my throat tight, and she smiled, a little shyly. "Do you like it?" I nodded, unable to speak. That night, as we sat on the back porch, the stars spread out above us, I found myself thinking about everything we'd been through. The betrayal, the anger, the pain, it had all been real, and it had left scars. But those scars had also taught us something important: love isn't perfect. It's messy and complicated and hard, but it's also worth fighting for. I turned to Alice, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the porch light. "We're going to be okay," I said, more to myself than to her. She reached for my hand, her fingers intertwining with mine. "Yeah," she said softly. "We are." And for the first time in a long time, I believed her. Subscribe to never miss a new story and discover even more captivating tales.